seems to be self-evident
that all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, folks. We're going to talk economics today. And my friend David Bahnsen is back on the show. David, thanks for being back on.
It's wonderful to be back with you.
So I don't know if you all remember David, you longtime listeners of the podcast. He's got quite the resume. One of the most well-known private wealth management managers. And it's one of the firms out in California, New York City. Manages over $3 billion in assets, regularly writing and interviewing on major shows and publications, on the board of directors for National Review Institute as well, and just all around very smart guy. And David, you just wrote a book, right?
That's right. I have been having a lot of fun talking about my latest book and getting in the subject of economics.
So what's the book called?
It's called There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths. And it's essentially meant to be kind of a daily primer on some economic truth, where I take a quote from, a great, it could be a still living contemporary economist like Art Laffer, could be a 20th century great who's no longer with us like Milton Friedman or Friedrich Hayek. And then there's plenty from even, going way back, your Adam Smiths and David Ricardo's going back to 18th or 19th century. And then I add my own commentary editorial for each and every one. And the book is just meant to be a kind of restoration of why we believe what we believe about economics.
Yeah, it might seem necessary these days. I'm assuming that's why you wrote it. I mean, you see economic ignorance on the left and the right in many ways. And so let's unpack that. I mean, what are the greatest threats to a free market society, to a prosperous society? What are the streams of ignorance that we're watching?
Well, I think that when you start with the left, I really do believe in a lot of fairness to Senator Sanders. I think Bernie Sanders has an impulse for socialism, that there's an emotional attraction to a high level of collectivism. And I also believe he is an intellectual proponent of it. I disagree with basically everything he feels and thinks, but I don't doubt that he feels it and thinks it. On the right, I believe there are a lot of people that feel capitalism, that have a general intuition for the relative advantages of how capitalism distributes risk and reward in a society. And that's a good thing. I'm glad that the American DNA has such a strong leaning towards an intuition or impulse that is free market oriented. But I don't believe we have that many that think capitalism, that have gone to the effort of creating a sort of foundation in their worldview as to why they believe what they believe. And therefore what happens is markets get tested. The great one of our lifetime has been the financial crisis. COVID came about then, about 11, 12 years later. And once again, we had to live through a lot of people deciding to figure out their principles in a crisis instead of applying their principles in a crisis. And so whether it's the sort of populism that we're dealing with over the last 6-7 years, whether it's some of the new critiques of market orthodoxy that you hear from the right, or even just the way that policy gets administered, I don't think that a lot of people have read a little Milton Friedman, a little Friedrich Hayek, and can understand why it is we ever adopted a worldview of free enterprise to begin with.
Yeah, it seems like liberal economic thinking and right-wing populism economic thinking, they both suffer from the same problem, which is any sign of imperfection is proof that you must dismantle the institution itself. Yeah. Right, that it's all bad. It's very emotional. It's not a conclusion that is arrived at with methodically and with reason. It's a reaction, and it's without leadership it won't fix itself. I mean, and so when you say no free lunch, I mean, is the common theme here that you're proposing that one of the main problems is this sense of entitlement, or this sense of this belief perhaps that everything is perfectible if there's enough authority given to a centralized commission of some sorts?
Yeah, that was mostly Milton Friedman's view of flawed economics, going back even to Bastiat with the famous broken window fallacy, the ability to look at something and only see visible but not invisible effects, or to see short-term but not long-term effects, or to see how it affects some people but not all people. So there's a myopia involved with Keynesianism, with socialism, with all forms of deficient economics. And
can you explain?
No free lunch,
can you explain the broken window fallacy? That might be illuminating.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's a good idea. Basically, Bastiat wrote in the middle of the 19th century, famous classical liberal philosopher, that if there's a bunch of hooligans that throw a brick through a window, and you get up the next morning and you say, wow, the shoe store has a broken window. This is great for the glass maker. He's going to have to come and repair the window, and that's going to create this economic benefit. And Bastiat's point was, what you don't see when you look at the benefit to the glass maker is what the guy who owned the store was going to do with the money that he's now going to pay the glass maker.
Right.
That you've diverted resources away from the tailor who he was going to pay to make a new suit, or the furniture maker he was going to pay to build a greater lounge in his store. There was some more efficient allocation of resources that was going to take place with that capital. And now it has been diverted to a less efficient allocation. And to praise that inefficient allocation is the definition of the broken window fallacy.
I see. Okay. So we got that.
So you hear it nowadays. You, of course, in Houston, you remember with the big hurricane, you heard, I have to listen to financial media all the time talk about natural disasters as if they're great for an economy. And it's not only sadistic and kind of a sick way to think about the world, but it's economically so ignorant. It's just the broken window fallacy on steroids.
Yeah.
And instead of it being one shop maker in a downtown village, it's an entire city or county or state. And the notion that a lot of money will get spent in repairing Houston after a hurricane completely ignores the more efficient allocation of those resources that otherwise would have happened. And so when we talk about wars and hurricanes as if they're good for an economy, I don't think people realize how stupid what they're saying really is.
Yeah, that's probably true. I mean, but going back to some philosophical underpinnings, why do you think you've already mentioned some of these guys, Bastiat, Hayek? You mentioned many others in your book. You mentioned Thomas Sowell quite a bit. You quote him at least 19 times.
Yeah.
Why are these economists, do you believe, underappreciated? Are they not being taught about enough? How is, especially with Thomas Sowell, because he's probably the only one still alive, of that list I just read.
Yeah.
How has he influenced you personally? I'm a big fan of Thomas Sowell. I think everybody should be. Maybe what are some of the books you'd recommend from him?
Well, I just from a philosophical standpoint, I really believe Conflict of Visions is one of the most important books for a conservative philosophy ever written, and his kind of codifying the constrained vision and the unconstrained vision of society as the key difference between a progressive and a classical liberal like myself. And it comes down to what you just said, the imperfectibility. Most bad politics and bad economics do indeed come down to the nirvana myth, taking something that has some brokenness in it or imperfection in it and comparing it to something that doesn't exist. And that was the fatal flaw of the 20th century socialist, was that they could not only not bring heaven to earth, They brought a lot of genocide and death and destruction. But even economically, there is a famous 5-minute clip of Milton Friedman with Phil Donahue that circulates around YouTube. And Donahue it goes right for the meat. He says, how can you get comfortable with the greed of capitalism? Mm-hmm. Do you really think the greed of these big companies is something that is an effective way to administer economics in our society? And Friedman responded not by trying to defend the greed of, back in the 70s, it was like General Motors or Chrysler or whoever the big companies were. But he went to say, excuse me, what is the society you know that doesn't run on greed? Are we really to believe that the greed of Red China is superior to the greed of the boardroom at General Motors? Is the greed of the commissar in the Soviet Union more desirable? And I think that is the point, that when you come into various inequities and inefficiencies, the capitalist cannot ever accept the premise that there is an alternative that beats it. We can say, I may think this CEO gets paid too much. I'm not sure it's really my business. I'm not really sure what any policy response should be. But yeah, okay, maybe I think that guy's overpaid. But then what is the alternative? Because if the alternative is Elizabeth Warren setting the pay scale of corporate America, I'm out. And I think that's what There's No Free Lunch comes down to, is the acceptance of trade-offs. And this is something that adults don't understand, but kids do. Kids go on a playground, and one of them has baseball cards and the other one has bubble gum, and they're trading with each other and playing with their games and toys, and they know there's no scenario by which I can have everything and you can have nothing. So I have to sort of adjudicate what I want and what I'm willing to give up. What do I give up that I want to get something else that I might want more? And there's a sort of utility consideration going on. I think kids get this when they're 5 and 6 years old. And I think something happens after people graduate from college where they stop understanding it.
Yeah, well, and one of the reasons they stop understanding it is because of the way we finance our debt. So it does appear to be unlimited to a lot of people. And there hasn't been you're starting to see hyperinflation now, but for a long time, there was really no consequences. That may be shifting now. Although the counter argument would be it's not just because of too much spending, it's because of supply chain constrictions that were permanently disfigured by bad lockdown policies. But in any case, inflation's out there. But look, the broader problem is still there, which is people don't have to make trade-offs if you just add more to the debt, because they can't internalize that trade-off that debt causes, because it's certainly not a short-term trade-off, so they don't really see it. And so how do we get people to understand that and understand the complexities of monetary policy?
Yeah, I think that whether it's monetary policy or fiscal policy, the excessive debt, it's the thing that you and I talked about last time I was on your podcast. I am obsessed with informing people that they are living through the cost of excessive debt, and it may not be hurting them a lot. And to the extent aggressive monetary policy has actually bid up the prices of assets, a lot of people who own real estate and stock portfolios not only are not hurting from it, they're benefiting from it, but it is measurable that we have now cut into our long-term real economic growth. We are living now for 13 years. This has nothing to do with COVID. This has nothing to do with this 1 year of an inflation spike. For 13 years, our real GDP growth has been 1.6% per year. And it was 3.1% for 60 years prior to that. So whether it's Japan, EU, UK, or the US of A, this is what has given legs to the populist uprisings, both in Europe and Britain and in the US, is people, I don't believe, are frustrated that Bezos is making too much money. They're frustrated that the real GDP growth is slowed to a point where it's impacting many people's real quality of life. We cannot have a Japanification take place in our country. We have too much resources, too much education, too much capital, too educated of a labor force. The 1.6% real GDP growth is a consequence of excessive government spending, and it's totally unacceptable.
But how? I don't think people understand why. Like, is there a layman's way to explain how debt leads to lower growth? Is it because we're spending money here or overtaxing here instead of allocating? Excuse me. Instead of letting the private sector allocate capital?
Yeah, so the way I try to explain to people is I say to them, if you have a bonus coming next year and you know it's coming, and you that is going to represent future growth, you're going to get it. And it's going to be something that could build your wealth, build opportunity. You could add to your lifestyle, your quality of life, and you go buy a new set of furniture today. And so when you get the bonus, you now have to pay off the debt you took for the furniture. You got the furniture today, but you do not get richer in the future. You have spent that future growth that otherwise would have come to you. Our society keeps growing into the ability to service the excessive debt because, like I said, we're an incredibly productive society, far more so than Japan, which is why their response to their deflationary bust of the 80s, 90s has been very different. We're more productive. There's all kinds of things I could say there. However, we're doing our best to change that. We've decided it's a good thing to have less kids, a good thing to go to church less, all of that. But we still have a lot of things going for us. But my point is that you apply the furniture bonus analogy to the national spending. In the future, when we get greater GDP growth, it's not getting added to our growth because we're having to pay back what the growth that we pulled forward into the future in a prior year, prior generation. And this is not only happening, but financial markets know it's happening, which is why the bond market continues to price in 2% yields for 10-year debt, despite even over the last year a pickup in the inflation rate, because the bond market does not believe that we're getting that long-term growth that we're used to. And this has been true throughout history of any society that is spent above its means. And so the best way to communicate it to laymen, I work on that every day. I think I've tried to become more effective of a communicator around this, but right now I'm still just trying to make the argument intellectually that if we believe the basic principle of there's no free lunch, then let's go figure out what the trade-off is going to be. I'm making the argument it's going to be future growth. It's going to be economic stagnation.
And of course, how that translates into people's lives means lower wages, less jobs, less opportunities. Now, again, the counter argument to that is... By
the way, it also probably means greater income inequality, which I thought everybody on the left was against. Mm-hmm. But if we're going to have a period of economic stagnation, I'm just going to tell you right now that there's a top 20% of highly meritocratic, intelligent, competitive, ambitious, resourceful people. They're not going to just take it lying down. They're going to still be producing and outperforming and outproducing. We all want that, right? We're a meritocratic society. But all it means is that the less resourced and less privileged and less educated, they're going to bear the brunt of the lower growth. So I don't have any reason to believe that the future Bezoses of our society are going to do less or going to do worse in an economy growing at 1% than 3%. They'll turn on the switch. They have the tools. Yeah. But there's plenty who don't.
Yeah, and that's a good point. The left doesn't. They don't want to believe in that point. Oftentimes, they don't want to believe that people have different skill sets or different or can offer different values to the economy. They don't want to believe that. Yeah. And it's sort of this very extreme sense of equity that they have. And I think they're self-aware of that because sometimes they'll even bash the idea of meritocracy, call it white supremacy. We've heard that before. Now it's more extreme lefties, but still it comes up in left-wing thought. And it has to in order to remain consistent, because if they're going to believe in this utopia, they have to go all the way. It also gets to another question about human flourishing and how we define it. And, and that's important because we have to figure out where we disagree on what is actually good and what is considered progress. And truthfully, the left and the right just value different things, I think. I think the left legitimately values equality at the expense of freedom and prosperity. They might not want to admit it, but maybe behind closed doors they will. But how should we define flourishing?
Well, I define it, this was the definition I came up with for high school economics students I teach in Newport Beach, California. Human flourishing is the spiritual and material peace, abundance, harmony, and joy that is the goal of human action. So humans are acting for the purpose of finding a kind of synthesized satisfaction in the material realm and in the more spiritual realm. We all know the money can't buy you love thing. There's a lot of rich people who are really tortured souls, and there's a lot of very content, peaceful, harmonious people that don't fly first class. So it's a both and, not an either or. And I believe that the concept of human flourishing, for me as a Christian, I'm very happy to bring in a very religious and very spiritual dimension to it. But I also think it's helpful for people, even apart from a specific faith conviction, to take a step back and understand that human flourishing has at least a high level connotation of material needs being met. It's very hard to have your kind of overall peace and harmony at play when you're starving or imprisoned. And yet at the same time, outside of the material dimension, there is a sort of satisfaction. Arthur Brooks has written a lot about the idea of earned success. Mm-hmm. And I believe that there's a sort of de Tocqueville spirit at play here in America that was always intended to synthesize God and gold, as my friend Walter Russell Mead has written about. That people had family, they had community, they had church or some sort of spiritual involvement, but then they also had work, they had vocation. Out of that vocational calling, people find a purpose. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the number one flaw economically of the left, is their willingness to divide up the society into those who produce and those who will merely consume. And then what the right does is say, see, it's not fair. All the people producing are paying the bills for all the people that don't produce. Well, that's all true, but that's not the biggest problem I have with it. It's that it's unfair to the people who are the recipients, because it's denying them their God-given dignity as producers, as workers, as people who are, in fact, capable of contributing to society. It makes them a ward of the state, a ward of someone else's generosity. That is what is creating this alienation and this purposelessness in our country that is awful for what we're experiencing right now.
Yeah, and that's different from, measuring prosperity as just in terms of GDP growth or other typical kind of output-based metrics, I think. And it's important for conservatives to be reminded of that sometimes, because we do have to go back to what we're trying to conserve. And in the end, it is this sense of human dignity that is only derived from purpose. Yep. And purpose is often work. You can see that in simply the psychology of people very oftentimes. And
that's why that theme is so fundamental in my book, the concept of creational economics, because I derive this principle from the garden, where God made mankind with dignity. And he said to mankind, you go out and cultivate the earth. You take the creation that I've made good and with potential, and you actualize it, you grow it, you steward it. And so Thomas Sowell writes all the time about how there is nothing we have right now, nothing we can physically hold in our hand that didn't exist back in prehistoric days. And the reason that the iPhone does what it does is the combination of mankind bringing his ideas to raw material, that ultimately sand to silicon to microprocessor to the miracle of digital age. This is a byproduct of human action. And what the left would seemingly imply in their worldview of economics is that there are some people that were made with super dignity, that they are the ones who get to really, really produce to help kind of feed the entire society with their ideas, their innovation. And every now and then, if they start showing off their riches a little too much, we're going to tax them more and regulate them more and say bad things about them. But really, we want them on that wall, and to mix metaphors here, because we have determined that there's apparently 50% of society that lacks that dignity, that lacks that capability of producing more than they consume. And all I want out of economics, this is not a political statement, it's an economic one. I want people to produce more than they consume, because that is the definition of wealth. And I don't find it very complicated when we boil it down to that basic anthropological truth.
Yeah. And what is the role of government? Maybe to create the conditions where at least you can do that.
That's exactly right. To enforce the rule of law and provide those basic protections and so forth. And this is where Hayek is so important, because he codified the term the knowledge problem. What you don't want government doing is what government cannot do, which is have the knowledge necessary to adjudicate time and place circumstances. So for them to set a policy from DC that is totally separated from the local realities in a particular community, in a particular transaction for very specific people, that they lack the knowledge to do so. And so this sort of Catholic doctrine of subsidiarity, the founders' political philosophy of federalism, they're all at play at once here. Bring things down to the most local level possible, not just because of the kind of political liberty at play, but because that's where the most economically efficient decision-making can take place.
And it gets to the conversation about utopianism. That's how I would describe the left. I think you mentioned Thomas Sowell's conflict of visions. It gets into all of these issues, but there's certainly a belief on the left that if you just try hard enough, you can create the perfect situation, the perfect outcomes. And how you define perfect, again, is up for debate. But for them, it's almost perfect equality and people having enough leisure time. I mean, who knows? Why is utopianism impossible? Why is it dangerous? And has the right engaged in this maybe a little too much? Has the populist right started to look at unrealistic emotional notions of prosperity and utopianism?
Oh, I think so, and I think the right's had to do so by borrowing from the left. They've looked at things that are unsatisfying in a fallen world, and then determined that there is some form of governmental policy or intervention that could help bring about their desired means. The difference between right and left-wing populism is just what those ends may be in a particular case. And even those lines sometimes are not really all that different, Yeah. But yeah, I would argue that using the government to do something it cannot optimally do, that should be better done in local communities, in families, with individual self-government responsibility, that whether it is a right-wing end or a left-wing end, that we are at danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Well, let's bring it to current events. I spent a couple podcasts now and made some videos on why people should care about Ukraine. Because like some people disingenuously ask, why do we care if there's a war in Europe? And some people genuinely ask, why do we care? They don't know. So maybe from the financial market side, from the economic side, how do these kind of events affect your average citizen?
Well, I personally believe that in the very short term, the great example, and a lot of people on the right are doing a great job making this point, President Biden has really walked into this. It does reflect the supply-demand realities of the United States energy sector, and that the ability to provide Europe its energy needs. This is political and military leverage that we don't have that we could have. And right now we're applying it with Russia and Europe, but it's been true for us with the Middle East for decades.
Right.
The entire post-World War II policy towards Saudi Arabia was driven by our need of their oil. I mean, I guess some people may deny that, but they're just really struggling with honesty. I think that the ability on a supply-demand basis to see the United States recapture that economic leverage has profound geopolitical benefits. But if we get past the specifics of oil prices now being up north of $100 and how that translates to the fuel pump for lower income American consumers, that's tangible, practical, and it's very relevant. Candidly, though, Congressman, before Russia invaded Ukraine, oil was still pretty darn expensive, right? This is not only a Russia story. What is specific to Russia, and I've heard you speak to this as well, is if the global economy had to reprice the sort of reversal of post-Cold War realities about the international order, this is a profoundly problematic dimension that we have been able to take for granted, that countries do not go around invading other countries anymore for land grabs. And if we were to say, you know what, Putin has more troops, he gets it, he wins. I think that how that gets priced into trade, how that gets priced into the cost of defense, and what that means strategically and geopolitically all boils into the price system. Prices have to then recalibrate those dangerous new laws. And we have a lot invested in maintaining what has been very beneficial in post-World War II and even post-Cold War Europe. And so that to me is what the fundamental issue is here economically, even apart from just the moral clarity of saying that the Ukrainian people are a sovereign nation and don't deserve to have missiles coming over their heads, for God's sake.
Unfortunately, the people who say they don't care about Ukraine, they already don't care about the moral implications. You know, they can see what's happening on the news and they can still say they don't care. So that argument doesn't work with them.
Yeah.
But economics has to, because economics is about self-interest. And but even then, it's difficult for people to see the reverberations because they're maybe not necessarily immediate. Now, the price of oil is certainly immediate, which affects all prices right away. But you got to take a step back sometimes and just tell people, look, if you live in chaos, you have less options. It really is that simple. If there's multiple countries around the world being invaded, you don't have as many people to trade with. There will be less wealth, and that wealth hits you. I wish it weren't true. Wish we could all go back to our corners and live in our bubbles. It is never how the world has worked. It certainly doesn't work that way now. And and the other thing I note to people is, look, if you're in a room full of dangerous people and you don't know them that well, you probably want to make as many good, solid friends as you can. All right, this is the benefit of alliances, and it just makes it less likely that the dangerous ones will punch you in the face. And they're certainly going to punch you in the face if you've told them ahead of time you'll never punch them back. So, it's just you got to bring it down to just basic human interactions. And of course, how this proceeds. I mean, China's watching this very closely. People don't really know what we get for Ukraine. Maybe it's some grain. Apparently, they make a lot of neon too, which is important for chip making. But then you take Taiwan; they make a lot of chips. Most of the chips that we use. It's used in everything, and people are like, well, okay, so you want to send the Marines to die to defend Taiwan because of an iPhone? No, we don't actually have to send Marines to die, first of all. You can maybe prevent this, first of all, but also it is not iPhones necessarily. It's MRIs, it's medical devices, things that are life-saving and that you truly rely upon. And I'm always struggling to find that conversation as well, because it's a real conversation for the American people. Like, why do we care? Why should we do the bare minimum to perhaps prevent these in the future? And everybody assumes that the choices are either appeasement or war, and those aren't the choices, luckily.
No, that's right. And that's what the process of statesmanship, and that's what the process of real leadership it looks like. And those kind of binary falsities, the false dilemmas, are what I guess cable news and Twitter is for.
Yeah.
But then when the door gets closed and there has to be some kind of grown-up adjudication of difficult situations, this also comes down to the reality of human nature. My view of economics is predicated on the fact that I believe that we live in a fallen world and that there's an imperfectibility on this side of glory. And so there's rules as to how economics can best function to provide a framework for human flourishing. My view of foreign policy comes from the exact same place. The notion that if we leave people alone, they will turn into good people is the strangest thing morally and intellectually that I've ever heard. It is set in defiance of the lesson of jihadism. It's set in defiance of the lesson of 20th century communism, but it's also set in defiance of thousands of years of what we know about human nature. I would love for people to highlight what they think the definable political philosophy is driving Vladimir Putin, and why Occam's razor doesn't just say this is a very bad authoritarian man.
Mm-hmm.
And if he is disgruntled about some aspect of how the Cold War ended, what exactly they think the United States is supposed to do to satisfy him, and what the limiting principle is.
Mm-hmm.
If he is dissatisfied about it, and he therefore believes that the advantage he is entitled to does not just mean he gets Ukraine back, but that there was some form. What if he wants Detroit? Is that okay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When does
the limiting principle?
Right. Because the same people who criticize any aid to Ukraine would also certainly question whether we should adhere to Article 5 if they invade Poland. Right. So we're bound by treaty to do that. It happens fairly quickly and automatically after a vote in NATO, of course. But they don't even get that, and it's why I have to bring it back to the.
And I'm curious what you think about this. I think this is an area where some of President Trump's criticisms of NATO were really legitimate, and now the anti-NATO people are missing the point of what President Trump was criticizing, saying these guys aren't paying their fair share, the 2% of GDP on defense that they committed to. It's a non sequitur to say, therefore, let's get rid of NATO.
Yeah, well, Trump was never.
The argument should be everyone pay up so that next time Russia invades Ukraine, Germany's in a more resourced position to deal with it.
Yeah, look, Trump had the right instincts on these things. He's labeled as this. I don't know if he's labeled this way, but certainly the isolationists follow Trump as like this, the America First movement. But Trump never believed that was putting America first. I think Trump had it right. Allies should pay more. We're not trying to get rid of NATO. We just think NATO should also benefit us. That makes perfect sense to me. Trump understood too the laws of deterrence, one of which is leverage, and we talked about economic leverage and energy leverage, but another is credible threat of force. Now he understood that, and he would just tweet it. and these dictators didn't know what he was going to do. It really is that simple. But some of the same people who say that any sanction on Nord Stream 2 is akin to warmongering. Well, then, but how can you support Trump then? I mean, these are conflicting ideas, and I think Trump was right. I think America first means America actually first. It doesn't mean letting your allies get their butts kicked and saying, well, America first. No, that's not America first. That's America last while authoritarians run the world. And then eventually they're close to you.
I think pragmatically, Congressman, this is the problem for people like you that want to be morally clear and articulate, is that it does provide dividing lines that then people can decide, are they in or they out, where President Trump's communication style allowed people to think they agreed with him when they maybe didn't, because he would say, I want to bomb the S out of ISIS. And he actually did go, launch that attack on Syria that night, and yet all the isolationists claim him as their own, because you're right, you had real hawks say he was theirs, and you had total Ron Paul isolationists say he was theirs. And of course, he can't be both, but he kind of gets away with it. It's pretty fascinating.
It is. I mean, I suppose you would call that good leadership. I don't know. I don't know what it is. But I mean, in the end, though, I liked his foreign policy. We quibbled about things, about, troop levels here and there. But it's strange how our own side really vehemently tries to divide fellow Republicans into warmongering neocons and peace-loving liberal hippie isolationists. I mean, I just don't understand the binary choice. It's a bit perplexing. Kind of sort of shifting gears here. What, as a wealth manager, how should people even look at the markets right now? How should people be investing and thinking about the future?
Well, I think that it's a pretty permanent truism that trying to time their way around geopolitical distresses has always been a fool's errand. You've had in a 5-day period of when Russia goes into Ukraine, you had two of the biggest days for the market in years. And then you've had plenty of sell-offs and downside volatility. That skittishness and the kind of jitters around uncertainty of geopolitical distress is a permanent part of investing. And I think people can do themselves real harm by trying to jump in and out around this stuff. Yet I do think if one is trying to be a little more tactical, the energy sector is incredibly investable. This is one of the great paradoxes that I love sharing whenever I get the opportunity. President Trump was arguably the most friendly president to the United States energy sector in the last 100 years, and energy was the worst performing sector for investors in his presidency. President Biden was absolutely elected to be an opponent of the U.S. energy sector, and he's done everything he can to be so. And energy was the best performing sector in the first year of his presidency, and is the only positive performing sector in the first couple months of 2022 going into this Russia-Ukraine conflict. So why is that? Because by cutting off sources of new production, by creating a greater regulatory framework that limits new supply, what you're doing is bidding up the value of Chevron and Exxon.
Yeah.
Period. Full stop. You're eliminating
So
new competition.
So Joe Biden is good for big oil.
There's no question.
Yeah, that's funny.
There's no question.
It's true. Yeah,
President Biden is good for big oil. And even some of the great pipeline companies, some of which in your home state of Texas, and I'm heavily invested in, they need to be able to build new pipelines for their growth. However, when no other competitors can build any new pipelines at all, it does make the value of their legacy pipelines even greater, particularly those that have high market share out of the Permian Basin. And so what President Biden's doing is helping those companies' stock value and hurting the American consumer who has to buy their product, namely oil and natural gas.
That's a really excellent explanation of it. It's not something I've heard very often, but you lay it out pretty clearly. But let's explain one more level. Why do you think the oil sector, though, underperformed under Trump? Was this just the power of business cycles?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that it first of all had to do cyclically with the glut of supply that happened to kind of culminate at going 2015 into 2016. He takes office in 2017, and we were sitting at record levels of stockpiles. So there was a need for less production. Mm-hmm. But then he approved in the Senate, the FERC committee got through, I think, 28 projects that the Obama administration installed. All of that would be bullish, but then COVID hit.
Yeah.
And so then it just kind of bookended the Trump presidency with this utter disaster in demand for oil and gas, and that kind of skewed the numbers quite severely.
Well, maybe the last topic is interest rates. What should people expect with interest rates? I have a specific question here that because you have a whole section on credit and sound money and monetary policy. There's been a lot of lax monetary policy for like over a decade at this point. There's one statistic here which I want you to explain for people. In a couple of years, the monetary base rose 87%. What does that mean? Why is that important?
I'm not totally convinced that it does, but in theory, the monetary base growing, meaning the amount of money supply growing higher than the level of goods and services, is what Milton Friedman would have told us is the textbook definition of inflation. Mm-hmm. The difference is that the monetary base is different than the circulated money supply. So quantitative easing added a ton to the monetary base, but none of that money got into the real economy. Yeah. And this was, and so we can talk about post-COVID QE, but we know this already from, first of all, 30 years in Japan, mm-hmm. and second of all, our $4 trillion of QE that we did after the financial crisis is it sat on the shelves of banks in what we call excess reserves. So it was an accounting entry between the banks, the primary dealers, and the central bank. It helped monetize the federal debt, and it helped bid up the level of assets, but it didn't circulate into the economy, which is why inflation stayed so subdued, even with that big increase in the monetary base after the financial crisis.
Okay.
What we have going on right now is a massive increase in demand after the very poorly thought through lockdowns, and humans doing their very best to be human again, at the same time that through some supply problems that are no one's fault and other supply problems that are very much someone's fault, you basically have a total inability to get the supply up to the level of demand at a time where there was excess liquidity into the economy. So what happens going forward? I think, unfortunately, we go back to this very low velocity of money, which is downward pressure on inflation, but unfortunately exacerbates economic stagnation. Velocity is just a fancy term for how much money is turning over in the economy. And so if you give $20 to your barber, and then your barber goes and gives it to the bartender, and that bartender goes and gives it to the person that makes this furniture, that money's circulating, and that can become inflationary. But at some point, when people just kind of stop turning over the money, and you see, and how does new money get created with greater loan demand? That's what we've seen huge downward pressure on. And why is there such low loan demand? Because a mortgage isn't new loans, right? That's just money turning over. All the good borrowers are already levered. All the good borrowers are already levered. That's the problem in an overly indebted society, is that you either have to create malinvestment. Now people have to go borrow money for dumb things. And I could think of a few of them over the last couple of years, right? The SPACs and this crypto and a lot of the speculative stuff. But then the bad investments go away, and you end up continuing this boom bust cycle. That's the story of modern Greenspan legacy monetary policy, is a boom bust cycle.
So how does that relate to inflation? Do you think that's going to be temporary? What's the debate there, temporary versus long term?
Yeah, this is where I have to be so careful, because politically, people on the right want me to say that I think it's going to be permanent and stay high. And they mistake me making an economic argument for me saying something defensive of the Biden administration. I want to be clear that what I'm about to say is worse than what the inflationistas are saying. I do not believe the inflation will continue to grow. But that's because I believe that disinflation will then become a partner to economic stagnation. And I would rather have inflation than economic stagnation, because economic stagnation takes away opportunity for growth and productivity and human flourishing.
Well, that's not a cheery outlook, but maybe quickly, why do you think that inflation turns to stagnation so quickly?
And I don't think necessarily be quickly. I think these supply bottlenecks are a real problem, and I don't know if it starts picking up in a quarter or 2 quarters. I do know they're all solvable problems, though. But fundamentally, it comes down to what I said about living above one's means, that excessive debt. This is algebraic. This is just a formula. You cannot have greater investment than you have savings. All invested dollars have to have first been saved dollars. And I guess someone could disagree with this, but I hope none of our listeners would. You cannot get growing productivity from declining investment. So you need more investment to get more productivity. More productivity equals more growth.
Right.
If you're going to have declining productivity in a time when you have a lot of new immigration or a lot of new fertility, okay, well, greater population could offset some declining productivity. Do you think that's what we're going to get? I mean, we seem to be pretty leaned in against more immigration right now, and we're certainly not having more babies. So I think that you're just mathematically facing declining productivity if you don't get greater investment, and you can't get greater investment when you have declining savings. By definition, more debt equals less savings. That's the sort of mathematical syllogism I'm offering our listeners.
And the solution to all this, maybe to wrap it up, is what exactly? Is it
spend within our means?
Spend within our means, and maybe let the free market go. Let our energy sector get the permits they need for pipelines and exports, and I mean, it's just basic economics. I wonder.
Basic economics. If economics is a study of human action, then it implies that it has to do with incentives. So was Art Laffer right that marginally reducing tax rates creates more incentive for productivity? Yes, he was. Do regulations, sometimes they're necessary for a free and functioning society, but are there some regulations that disincentivize growth and productivity? Yes, there are. So I don't think this stuff's hyper complicated economically, but I think it's hyper complicated politically. And that's as much a problem of the people, the populace, as it is a problem of the government. But fundamentally, the economics of it are that production minus consumption equals wealth. And when we overconsume governmentally or in the private sector relative to our productive output, we get a negative impact on wealth, and that's what I want to see reversed.
Yeah, well, and that's the fundamental problem. It is a problem with the population because more and more people are willing to be bought off by false promises, and politicians are very easily take advantage of that, and especially like promises that can be made with a lot of fiery rhetoric, but almost impossible to adhere to because it's, I mean, in some sick, twisted way. The way politics works, it's what do I want to say here? It's as if it feeds the outrage, and when people are outraged, they click things more, they engage more, and they give more money, and it's almost like some want to lose, and there's certain leaders who I think unfortunately take advantage of that and just play upon that resentment politics.
That's right. And that's where I'm unwilling to approach economics divorced from my moral code, which comes from my religious presuppositions. Covetousness is the 10th commandment for a reason. And if we look to solve for various economic inequities by simply bemoaning those who have achieved a lot, the only people who will suffer are the people who have not yet achieved a lot. Because the people that we are going to hate and resent, first of all, they're not going to care. They're fine. And second of all, it cuts off the greater opportunity, the greater, more democratic distribution of prosperity that a less covetous society is capable of. That income inequality thing is a big deal because it's one thing when AOC and others are making the argument. There are people on the right now that are really concerned about superlative wealth from certain folks. I want to do everything I can to crush crony capitalism. If anyone's getting wealthier because they're using the government as a partner in their business, I don't want that either. I know you don't. But Congressman, we have got to tell people this basic fact. If tomorrow we could divide all of the wealth in the world evenly by the population, that every single person would get their even amount of the total capital stock on earth of cash and real estate and stocks and bonds, and everyone then got an even amount, 5 minutes later, there would be wealth inequality. People have different tastes, different appetites, different decisions, different responsibilities. The fundamental fact is that humans are going to act in different ways, and that creates inequality. The role of government cannot be to solve for inequality. The role of government must be to solve for constrained opportunity. That's what government should do, is eliminate any constrictions on opportunity. That's it.
It's a great way to end. David, thanks so much for your expertise. And again, the name of the new book is No Free Lunch. All right. David, thanks again for coming on. It's good to see you.